Basically, I take photographs, photographs of archaeological and historic features in the landscapes. And I guess that my overall theme is the marks left by man in that landscape. This particular talk will be about my photographs of Abbeycwmhir and some of the places associated with it. But I would stress that this is work in progress. None of what I tell you is final and complete. Let me see if I can. I thought I'd start with this photograph, culled from the Royal Commission archive. It shows the Abbey walls in 1963. And the point I want to make is that ground-based photographs can be very valuable because, amongst other things, they record the situation as it is at a moment. And this particular photograph illustrates that in 1963, the Abbey walls were quite vulnerable. There's all those trees growing out of it. Aerial photographs can show a lot which cannot be seen easily from the ground level. This particular photograph is 1986 and was taken by Chris Musson for the Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust. It shows the road snaking through the village. The farm is here. The Abbey ruins is over here. And here you see that the snow is just at a state where it highlights some of those plough marks. And I think I should say that to take this photograph, Chris was poking his camera out of a small plane, traveling at between 100, 120 miles an hour at about 1,000 feet, and whipping past this particular site, clicking the camera as he went. And I must say, I have huge respect for any archaeologists, photographers who are suffering in that way, as they still do when they take photographs from planes. It's not an easy task at all. This image is from 2011. This is a drawing provided by Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust as a summary of the situation of the findings of the archaeology for Abbeycwmhir at that time. And you'll see the main Abbey buildings here, plough marks, the lake, a river, and around it all, a proposed boundary for the Abbey. Now, when I was invited to look at the Abbey, photograph the Abbey, this is the diagram that I was given to show what is currently known about this site. I should say that the cloister marked here does not exist. It was a hypothetical, if they built a cloister, it would be here situation. Sorry, I've skipped. Sorry, heavy fingers. Here we are, got the hang of it now. This is one of my photographs taken by a drone. And basically the drone acts like a tripod in the sky. I can position it to take photographs. It's as simple as that. As you will see in what follows, my work results in two types of image. One is the simple oblique photograph, and this is an example. The other is where I may take hundreds of photographs flying over a site, put them all together, and extracting a lot more information from them. That is photogrammetry. Sorry, I'm being very heavy-handed here. This photograph shows the walls in 2019. In a lot better shape than in 1963. This is what I can conjure up when I fly my drone in a pattern, a grid, over the area, put the images together, rather like you'd put together photographs to create a panorama with, in fact, most digital cameras these days. The difference is that I've got about 200 photographs there combined. And I've placed the photograph of the that I've created on top of an image from Google Earth to illustrate the position of the Abbey amongst those tree-covered slopes. This is tilting Google Earth. And the point I want to make with this photograph is that when I first started thinking about the Abbey, some 3 or so years ago, and the Cistercians, I knew very little about either, but my idea about the Cistercians was that they secreted themselves in isolated places. And this photograph, I think, shows that they were a bit cleverer than that. They actually put this Abbey here at a junction of 4 valleys. There are roadways, or trackways rather, at the period, going along east, west, north, south from this position. It controls a hub, a communication hub. It allows them to link to the wider Cistercian network and trading and all that goes with that. So they're not as isolated as one might think in those early days. This image is complex. It shows the whole of the Abbey precinct. There's a lot of information here. Let me just sort of get your eye in, as it were. Here is the main road where it loops around the village there and continues. Here is the river. The lake is here. The Abbey ruins are in the middle here. We've got a lot of earthworks out here, banks and ditches of various forms. We've got the plough marks, which we noted on Chris Musson's photograph here. And we've got the outer perimeter of the precinct along here. We'll be looking at some of these in more detail, but I hope you will agree that this is a huge advance on the diagram with which we started. I'm zooming in on that diagram now. Here is the Abbey. We were thinking at the beginning that we might find some marks in this area to show that a precinct may have been built. And although you've got some straight lines, horizontal and vertical, these aren't of any precinct. This line going across here actually discharges into the river. It's the drain. This line here, going past the mound, was a path down to the lakeside. So we cannot, with the photogrammetry, confirm that there was any precinct built. But what did turn out to be a huge surprise was this area here, just off the transept, or where the transept would have been. This is a tree line going right through it. The Abbey walls here. And do you see this rectangular feature which goes under the tree line? It appears to be the base of a building. And that is how it is interpreted as of this moment. Not confirmed by excavations or anything, but the base of a building. Now, in the 1820s, when the whole of this site was beautified and a lot tidied up, there's no mention of finding anything there. So this is basically unrecorded, a total surprise. Still to be investigated further. This bank here is also quite interesting. I hope you can see that it overlaps an earlier bank, this one left to right on this image. In other words, it was later. And that bank may have been thrown up during the English Civil War in 1644, when the whole abbey was fortified. We also have a line across. It's more prominent in other images, but take my word for it. There's a line across, a depression. You can actually walk over it and see it. This was found in the 1820s, and it was a partition within the church, and it seemed to divide this large nave into an area, a living quarters for the monks, divided off from the more liturgical religious area where they would have worshipped. At the same time, in the 1820s, these two doorways were seen to be blocked off with similar material. So there was a closing down of the abbey at some point, probably because they didn't expand with cloisters and all the rest of it, and certainly no transept. This image shows much the same area. The mound, which appears to be made up of the debris collected together in 1820s, when this whole thing was made into a rather romantic garden setting. The walls, your line across the abbey there, the building structure there, or what's thought to be a building structure, and this bank coming down here. So, particularly for that building, these are discovery photographs. Moving now to the west of the farm is here. This area here, you can see the plough marks. You can also see a big bank here. No idea at all when or what function that may have served. But in this square here, parch marks were discovered by on some of Toby Driver's photographs. He works and takes aerial photographs for the Royal Commission, and they were interpreted as graves. And was it 2 years ago now, Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust did some digging there and did in fact confirm that there were graves there. This is a cemetery. This is the cemetery, presumably, of the abbey. No skeletons were found because they would have dissolved in this ground. Instead, the bodies had been reduced to a stain at the bottom of the graves. Rather sad end, I think. I don't want to be too philosophical at this point. Over on the western extreme of the precinct, this is the precinct boundary coming along here, and it's long been puzzled why there seems to be another bank within that, a double precinct boundary. And current best interpretation, I don't say it's the only one, but probably the best interpretation at the moment, that this was also thrown up as a defensive structure to guard the abbey, the garrisoned abbey, from any approach from the west. It was the royalists inside the abbey, and it was very important to them, important to the parliamentarians as well, probably because it guarded those 4 valleys. It was the 3rd most expensive site, garrison sites, that the royalists held in Wales, to give some idea of its significance and importance. And this area here appears to be part of that defensive structure. The parliamentarian force, after a brief skirmish in December 1644, captured this, and 300 royalists were captured, and the abbey walls reduced to make them unfit for any future military purpose. There is another curious thing which I have no real explanation of. This is now dodging across to the east of the abbey. Here is the road. This is the bridge you come across. And I just refer to this ditch here, a ditch and bank across the valley, penetrated by the roadway, modern road. Different appearance on either side because of different farming practices. And here nearer the river, it may have been subjected to flooding. There are also some sunken trackways, which we can pick up quite clearly. There's another one actually going along here, which some other images show more clearly. But when that ditch and bank was thrown up is unknown. It could have been another Civil War defensive line across the valley bottom. It could have formed part of a boundary of the abbey itself, an outer boundary, or it could be much earlier. At the moment, that is a mystery. Leaving my photographs for a moment, this is a LiDAR image. LiDAR stems from an aeroplane flying over this area and firing a pulsed laser beam across it, scanning across it backwards and forwards, as the plane flies over this part. And by a very clever wizardry, they managed to pick up a reflection of this pulsed beam from the top of trees, for example, and from the ground. And they can subtract the trees. And this is great because it enables us to see under the heavy canopy of the trees. And in this area, it is particularly interesting because we can follow the bank, the precinct boundary, defining the limits of the abbey. Just to give you an idea, these LiDAR images are always a bit chunky because the resolution isn't particularly good. It amounts to about 2 meters per pixel, whereas the drone photography, we get it down to 2 to 3 centimeters per pixel. Typically, if I go lower, if I fly lower, I can get better than that. But typically, I'm running at about 2 to 3 centimeters per pixel. So you can see it's very detailed, and I can zoom right into my imagery, my photogrammetry, and that I take with the drone. But back to this image, we've got the abbey at the center and the boundary coming around here. This next image was made up by Mark Walters of the Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust. And you can see the boundary coming along here, under the trees. It drops down, crosses the river, and probably comes back along where the modern road is now, across the town, because the road was deflected much later by Wilson, I believe, in the 1820s or 30s, and back here. And you can see this emplacement, plus a little spur down here, which may have been the Civil War garrisoned control point for the road. Tipping this on its side, again, you can look along the boundary here. There it goes, above some quarries, by the way, and then around here, across the river, and back here. The gatehouse would probably have been in this sort of area of the original abbey. So one thing that we've established is the perimeter, as well as a lot of details within that precinct. By contrast, this is detail from an 1817 map made by the Ordnance Survey, as it is a sketch map before they did later surveys, which led to our modern OS maps. It is the first detailed map we have of this area, and I'll be referring back to it occasionally during the rest of my talk as being the first evidence we have of the layout of the area around the abbey, the first information we really have about actual locations, the geography of the area. And there are other documents going back 1200 and some before, but this is a map and important. And I just draw your attention to how in 1817, how few buildings there were. We basically have the farm and the church and very little else. I now want to zoom out using a modern OS map. I want to use this really to locate some of the places that we've been investigating with photogrammetry and photography. The Abbey is down here, nestled amongst these tree-covered slopes. I've put here a little extract from that 1817 map, just to indicate the Abbey, to act as a marker. And one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on as a team, a lot of teamwork going on here, is looking at this particular area, a farm now called Abbeycwmhir, but originally is recorded on the early maps and, the early 1800s maps and some documents. There were 4 farms there, now amalgamated. And this is the area that I have surveyed, photogrammetry. It covers about 350 acres. So it's quite an extensive study of that area. And although I won't zoom into it here, you must bear in mind that I can zoom into about an inch anywhere in that area using the photographs and the analysis that has been done. This has proven to be very interesting. It's about roughly 3 miles from the Abbey, walking distance, so well within the compass of operation by the Abbey in Abbey times. The second area is Groes, north of the Abbey, about the same distance as Abbeycwmhir, about 3 miles or so. And in that area, I have done some photography earlier this month. So this is very recent. These 2 examples are important because if I zoom out again, you see these 3 sites. And in the 1990s, David Williams did a monumental work. He looked at all the Cistercian lands in Wales and mapped them. It's an authoritative and very informative atlas of Cistercian lands. And for Abbeycwmhir, the core lands are within that boundary, that green boundary. This excludes lands they held granges much further afield. But this is the core lands. And you see how these 3 sites that I've already shown the Abbeycwmhir one, but together with the 2 sites, which I'm about to show you, you can see how they form a pattern right at the very bottom, close to the Abbey. Now, we believe from the results of the work that's been going on during this project that this map is not accurate. It's not precise. It's a good guide, but it's not precise. And we've been able to trace back those farms to the Abbey period, to being controlled by the Abbey. And this is, again, work in progress. The boundaries now we're pushing out into this direction, quite a long way. And I should say that most of the lower farms, this is a big generalization, but most of this area, extending out, including that one, were given to the Abbey in the year 1200 by Roger Mortimer. The upper areas were by and large donated by Welsh princes some few decades later. And although they appear to be quite separate on this map, in fact, these are mainly uplands, so they would have been sheep walks, which would be shared and parceled out between these various farms. So it's much more connected than this particular mapping shows. And I want to emphasize that although this was given to the Abbey in 1200, or the lower part was, this wasn't unoccupied land previously. There are a lot of other remains in the area going back to the Bronze Age. So it's a fair assumption that there were people living and farming in this area for a good few thousand years before the Cistercians took over their ownership of the land. So let's look in detail now at what we've picked up in this area on Cwm Fôn. This is an aerial photograph looking down towards the south. It's the southern area of the farm. The abbey is around the corner here, down this narrow valley here. Sorry, the abbey is just around the corner from this valley. And a notable feature of this are these sinuous banks, one here and another one here. And these seem to represent expansion of the original farms, which were probably down here closest to the abbey, up into the sheep walks. And they did this in these two successive waves. These are very substantial banks, I should add. I've seen a lot of Offa's Dyke, which was less spectacular than some of these banks. So they had these sinuous embankments encroaching up onto the sheep walk. And then they partitioned the area between these banks with other fields. And it's a notable feature that the size of these fields tends to get bigger as you go up into the sheep walk, away from the much smaller fields, original fields that we can pick up in this area. The river goes along here, by the way, so it makes a lot of sense that the original Cistercian developments of the farms should take place closest to the abbey, near the river, down here. Oh, there's also a nice route, I should mention, coming through the abbey, winds its way up here, and then it goes out to St. Harmon. So there are other routes as well, but that one is particularly prominent, and it looks as though some of those earlier farms were clustered around that routeway, and the fields respect the line of that routeway. This is another photograph showing those banks, looking from a slightly different angle. Sinuous banks, the routeway from the south, sorry, from the abbey, from the south part, over the south part of this farmstead. Now, this is very different picture to that we see in the northern part of the farm, much more overgrown. And you can see again, though, those sinuous banks going down to there. And there's another one coming around here, down into this little valley, this stream. This area has not been particularly developed over the past few hundred years. Perhaps I should say that those outer banks that I've outlined, the outer ones, were shown on the 1817 map. So there was no development of the farms after that time. All the enclosures that we have been looking at occurred before the 19th century. But in this photograph, I just want to draw your attention to, and we'll be speaking about, two features which were in their different ways unexpected. There's one here, and another one just in this area here. Taking the second one. This was discovered when Ian Lewis was clearing some of the vegetation of this area. And you can see that nestled underneath the bank, there's this lovely little circular earthwork. Completely unexpected and obviously unrecorded. Here it is, again, slightly different angle. Quite a major bank, and this is nestled up to it. What I found interesting, that there is a subtle change in direction of the bank. Do you see how this is going straight along here, and then it kinks slightly out and then kinks back to meet at this point. Now, whether the bank was respecting a pre-existing earthwork circle, or the circle was just created later to fit under the bank, we don't know. It makes sense, if you're going to do anything at all, to be this side of the bank, because of course along one side of the bank you've got a ditch which acts as a drain. And in fact, this coming down to this point here of these two banks, there and down here, is to deflect water into what was now an overgrown drain here, to take it all down to the river, drainage ditch or stream. But this circle is a bit of a mystery. It looks as though it hasn't seen a lot of wear and tear. It doesn't take us back to Bronze Age or prehistoric circles. It's quite sharp in places. We have speculated, rather inconclusively, I think, as to what it could be. Some form of enclosure for shepherds or farmers at this period, a cockpit, but very little has come out so far of our speculations. Nothing conclusive. If anyone has a bright idea, please let us know. Here's a photogrammetric image of that self-same circle. A little mystery. The other area I pointed to on that wide-angle shot is somewhat less of a mystery. We have a bank with its drains on the outside, its ditches on the outside, meaning that this is a drier area, and nestled into it is a rectangular structure, earthwork, which we can interpret as a hut. Small building, a dwelling. Alongside it is a now silted upstream into the Abbeycwmhir brook, down at the bottom. Now, this is interesting from a number of reasons. One of which is that nothing appears on the 1870 map or any other record of this earthwork, this little, a bit like a Hafford, and a building for occasional use. But when you see it against the background of the fields around it, you realize that in fact, that it is part of a field system. And it almost certainly was for continuous occupation as a farmstead. So as well as the 4 recorded farmsteads on this farm, we appear to have a 5th farmstead, which came into being during some milder period, milder either climate or economic. Opportunities were taken to extend into this area, and then for various reasons abandoned. Climate, economic, family, no way of knowing. No written records at all of this. And it has never been recorded in the archaeological records that exist. But fascinating to think that this was once a small farmstead. And of course, there are many of these 4 small farmsteads along the marginal fringes of between the uplands and the enclosed fields of the farms today that you can see. They I was almost going to say litter the landscape, but there's a lot of them, and amazing to see just how many farms were abandoned in these marginal areas. Moving on to a very interesting enclosure. This is way up towards the north end of the sheep walks. An enclosure on 3 sides, open on one side. This is the track of a sheep track going through it. So an enclosure which could be sealed off with temporary hurdles or some such woven hurdles. And down below, we have a platform, the site of some shelter building on this flat area. And there's a stream coming out, a spring coming out below that. Slightly different view of it is here. I think this brings out the fact that this little platform with whatever hut it had on it is somewhat sheltered. It's down a bit below it. The size of this enclosure is about 35 meters with an opening of, let's say, about 17, 18, something like that, meters. And it's a bit of a puzzle stuck up there, away from all the other farms, totally detached. Now, I don't know very much about husbandry of sheep, particularly in the Middle Ages. But being fairly practical, let's look at the facts here. This was constructed where the sheep are, on the sheep walk. It is a relatively small enclosure. You can't get a huge flocks of sheep roaming around inside this. It's quite small, relatively small. There's a shelter for some herdsman or shepherd. And it has that large opening, which can be temporarily closed. So you can drive sheep in and out of it relatively easily. Most critically, it has no water supply within it. Now, this may be the clue. Sheep cannot be kept in there for long periods. There's not enough grazing anyway, but there's no water. And if there's no water, we have to ask ourselves, well, why are you bringing sheep into this area? Presumably frequently. And the rationale that I've come up with is that it's an echo of that hymn, while shepherds watched their flocks by night. It's simple, it's easy to envisage the flocks being driven in here for protection, and the shepherd with the hut there looking after them overnight, then releasing them again in the morning. If you wanted to keep the sheep for longer periods, then you could simply drive them down to some of the big fields associated with the farms below. So we've got a temporary overnight accommodation for sheep, protecting them in the classic biblical manner. So what were they protecting them from? Setting aside humans, currently I understand that wild predators are really foxes and badgers. But in the Middle Ages, there were wolves. Wolves were a big threat. The Normans carried out numerous campaigns to try to eradicate wolves. They were the great danger for farms, for sheep farming. And the interesting point here is that by about the year 1500, wolves had been eradicated from England and Wales. They were at least very, very rare. No records of them after that period, after about 1500. So that leaves us to the conclusion, if this argument is correct, that this shelter, this protective shelter, was made before 1500. The abbey was dissolved in 1536. So this would have been contemporary with the functioning of the abbey. I'll move on. This is grois. Grois have the ambiguous meaning of either a cross, religious style, or or crossroads. The grid you see above it, the green line, is an example of how I prepare for photogrammetry over a site. I set up a grid pattern, and when I get on site, I can press a button and the drone automatically flies that grid, taking photographs as it goes. And when it's done so, I can compile those photographs to form various images and analyze the three-dimensional nature of that landscape. Grois itself is quite an elongated, normally thought of as being an encroachment. This is on Bing maps underneath. Here's a pathway here, a track, which comes down from the valley and goes over into the distance. There's another trackway going up here, and that also curls off. Sorry, my pointer was getting caught up in some paperwork on my desk. When I compile these photographs into a single photograph, I get this. And you can see these trackways going up, going across here, and this very well organized outline of this encroachment, this farmstead. When we wave the magic wand, we can see more detail. Trackway going past the door, trackway here. This trackway appears to go round this slight hill and off there, but with a spur, later spur cut in to come across here. Most encroachments on commons, common area that I've seen in this area, tend to be a rather more haphazard, small scale encroachment. Here we have something that appears very well designed, with a very large platform in the middle. This is shown better here. Of interest to me was that the tithe maps, the tithe apportionments, say that in 1839, this was occupied by a John Jones, a house and garden, and covering a total of 5 acres. Now, 5 acres is not exactly large area, and certainly not enough to provide a viable excuse for this whole well thought out structure. And you see from this angle how the platform has been well dug into this hillside. There's a lot of work went into making that. Again, this isn't a later encroachment in which someone attempts or succeeds maybe in stealing some land from the landowner of a common. This is well thought out establishment. I resorted to looking at a LiDAR image again, quite a wide area. We have the large sheep walk of Cefnderys up here. Our farmstead, Grois, is just here, and you can see the platform just under that laser pointer. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is on a sort of col, so that you've got your pathway coming up here and then probably crossing over and down that ridge. So it's on the route between 2 valleys. It also links up with some north-south routeways. Here is the modern road. I hope you can see just to one side of it, the braided pathway of some earlier routeway, a ridgeway. It's actually evidenced through this now forested area before it is picked up by modern forest roadways down here. So Grois, in a funny sort of way, a bit like Abbeycwmhir in the valley, Grois is at a communications hub. Communications of the day being by road or trackway. So we have a reason for putting something there, well away from these other farms. All the other farms are down here in the valley. You can see the fields on this side. It's very deliberately been put there, very well planned there. And my second clue to this area was this little valley here. It's only a couple of 100 yards away from our building structure of Grois itself, just over the hill. And I could see these marks. When I flew over it, I was really surprised. What resulted from flying over it was these images. Here's the view just into the valley, looking up the valley. But look at these field structures, large fields, large enclosures, with a platform for some buildings. This had never been previously recorded as such. There's a note, a couple of sentences on a photograph by the Royal Commission. It's a possible settlement. But I think we're looking at something a little bit different. And it contrasts very well to that site we looked at a moment ago, up on that sheep walk at Abbeycwmhir. For a start, this one's got water. It's a stream running through it. And we've got what seems to be a development. Field 1, and they added on a second field, and then a third field. So we're looking at something which was economically successful. We may not know how long it took to create or to add on those extra fields, but there's growth here, very, very easy to recognize. And I think this is early findings, early thoughts on this, is that we must look at Grois, not just that first platform, but we must also look at it in conjunction with this field system in the valley. And this seems to be the only valley where there's a nice little stream going through it on the whole of the Cefn Derys upland area. So we've got what appears to be, if we take it all together, something which one might think of as a sheep ranch, where you've got this central point, the Grois settlement, buildings there, final collection at a transit point of routeways, and you've got this handling area down here for collection of sheep, and you've got the whole of Cefn Derys as pasture for the sheep. Now, dating things like this is almost impossible. You can't do it from photographs alone, obviously. You can look at the fields and say, oh, that looks typically medieval. Records don't exist, and obviously no excavations or anything have ever been taken place here. But if I were to speculate, and this is speculation, I'm wondering whether this whole system, quite close to the Abbey, 3 miles away, walking distance, whether it is what I think we might think of as being a model farm, something developed by the Cistercians in this area to show off husbandry techniques, innovative techniques in the management of sheep in upland areas. An exemplar. And in thinking about this, I think about the Cistercians rather like a modern multinational franchise company, McDonald's if you like, where they spread the word by creating these areas, in the branches. Abbeycwmhir becomes a branch from the headquarters of the Cistercian order in France. And through this network, I've already commented on the fact that Abbeycwmhir is not isolated, by no way. The ideas can be disseminated indeed throughout Europe. Now, even if it isn't of Cistercian origin during the Abbey period, though that is possible, quite possible, that is consistent with what we are seeing. It certainly was influenced by the introduction of management techniques for sheep. So there we have it. Abbeycwmhir, excellent example of a monastery nestled down here with its network of communications with other monasteries and with trade. Some of its farming practices seen down here in the development of farms in a valley, and up here, the development possibly of some of its farms on the upland. Now, I would stress that this is very much work in progress. And what I'm giving you are some of my first impressions of this. We've got a lot more work to do. On the theme of a lot more work to do, perhaps I may leave you now. Thank you.